Jon from Supabase here, and in this video we're going to learn all about the brand new Supabase Auth Helpers package for Remix. Now the Supabase Auth Helpers are a collection of framework-specific tools that we've been working on to make authenticated server-side stuff with Supabase as easy as it is client-side, using cookies to store session data rather than local storage. We currently support Next.js, SvelteKit, and Remix, but we're keen to build adapters for any frameworks people want to use, so let us know in the comments what you want to see next. Additionally, in this video, we check out the brand new user validator hook from Remix. This allows us to programmatically call the loaders for any routes active on the page and keep our data in sync with what the user should be able to see. Very excited, so let's get into it. Let's start by navigating to database.new to create a new Supabase project. I'm going to name my project Remix Dashboard. And then I'm going to click this button to generate a new password, but make sure that you copy this somewhere like a password manager, because this is your database password and the only time you'll actually see it. Now for the region, you should select a region that's close to your users for best performance, but since I'm the only user of this application, I'm going to select Oceania, Sydney, which is closest to my location. And now I'm going to click Create New Project. Now this will take a little bit of time to set up our project, so while we're waiting, let's go and create our Remix application. Let's type npx create-remix to create a new Remix application, and my application is going to be called Remix Dashboard. Now this is going to step us through some questions, so I'm going to say yes, I would like to install this package. Now what you select here won't matter too much for this example, but I'm going to say just the basics. I'm not actually going to deploy this application, so I'm going to say Remix App Server. I'm going to make it a TypeScript project, but don't worry, I'll step you through all the scary type stuff. And then I do want to run npm install. And once that's finished, we can change into our directory, we can open it up in VS Code, and now we can open up the integrated terminal to run npm run dev and start our development server. And we can now navigate to our application in a browser by going to localhost over port 3000. And we see this template here, which matches our route at app/routes/index.tsx. And we'll see this welcome to Remix message, and our list of links are what are rendering out on the page. So we can probably just leave this landing page as is, and we want to create a new route for our dashboard. So that's dashboard.tsx. And in here, we're just going to export a default function for our dashboard, which is going to return a h1 that says dashboard. And we can now navigate to this route by going to /dashboard. And we see our dashboard heading. Now, eventually we're going to be fetching some data from Supabase to display in our component. And so let's export out a loader function, which is going to fetch a profile for this specific user so we can display it in our dashboard. But let's start by just returning some static data where the ID can be set to 1 and the name can be set to Jon. We can now access this data that's returned from our loader down in our component by saying const data is equal to calling the useLoaderData hook, which comes in from @remixrun/react, and we want to call that function. And for now, we just want to print out whatever we got back. So we're going to render a pre-tag and then use json.stringify to say we want to render out our data. And then the second parameter is going to be null and the third parameter is going to be 2. And this will just allow us to print out that JSON object like this. So let's go and create some data in Supabase so that we can display it in our application. Let's head on over to the table editor here and let's create a new table. To get this wired up, we're just going to create a test table. We're going to leave row level security enabled, and then we can just leave our columns as they are at the moment. So just an ID and created at, which are automatically populated, and click save to create this new table. And now we can click insert row to create some dummy data. Again, we don't need to fill in any of this. We can just click save, and then we'll insert a second row. And now we want to take this data and display it in our application. So the first thing we want to do is declare some environment variables to connect to our Supabase instance. So let's create a .env file and make sure this is in the rootmost part of your project. And in here, we want to declare a Supabase_URL and also a Supabase_anon_key. And we can get these two values from our Supabase dashboard. So if we go down to settings and then API, and I might need to make this a little bit bigger just so we can see, but under API settings here, we have our project URL. So we can copy that as our Supabase_URL. And then under project API keys, we have our anon public key. So this is the one that we want for our Supabase_anon_key. And we can go back to our application and fix up our windows. And we won't need this .env file. And in case we're worried about those values being committed to source control, if we have a look at our .gitignore file, that's automatically ignored by Remix. Okay, so back over in our dashboard, we want to update this loader to fetch data from Supabase. So let's start by installing the supabase-js library. So let's quit our development server, and if we type npm install or I at supabase/supabase-js, this is the package that we'll use to create a client that can talk to our Supabase instance. And once that's finished, we can run npm run dev again to start our development server. And now in our loader, we want to replace this static data with data coming back from Supabase. So let's first create a Supabase client by calling the create client function. And that comes in from at supabase/supabase-js. We then need to pass this our environment variables for our URL and our anon key. So we can access those by saying process.env.supabase_URL and then process.env.supabase_anon_key. Now TypeScript is not happy here because these values might not exist. And so we can fix that by adding an exclamation mark because these should always exist in every environment that we're running in. Now we can go and fetch some data by awaiting a call to Supabase. We want to select data from the test table, and we just want to select all columns. Now, because this returns a promise, we now need to make sure that our loader is async. And now, instead of returning that static data, we can return the data that we got back from Supabase. Now, by saving our file, Remix has detected those changes and has refreshed our page, and it's looking like we're not getting any data back from Supabase. And we can try refreshing again just to make sure that that's the case. So what's going on here? Well, when we created our test table, we chose to leave RLS enabled, and this will automatically deny all actions to this table by default. So we can't insert, update, delete, or select anything from this table. So if we want to enable one of these actions, then we need to write a policy. So if we head over to authentication and then policies, and looking at the test table, we can see that RLS is enabled and no policies have been created yet. So if we click new policy, there are some templates that we can look at, but we're going to go full customization. The name of our policy is going to be anyone can select test data. This policy is going to enable the select action. We'll just leave target roles set to public, which is the default. And then we need to declare an expression here that either evaluates to true or false. Since we want to enable read access for anyone, we can just put the value true in here and then click review. And this is going to show us the SQL that's going to be run against our database. We can click save policy to run that SQL. And now we've enabled that select action on our test table. So if we go back to our application and refresh, we'll see that that test data is now correctly coming back from Supabase. So let's add authentication so our users can sign in with Supabase. Let's head over to our root.tsx file, which is a special component that wraps around the rest of our application. And so this is a great place to create a Supabase client that we can share across our application. But if we come down to our component and try to do the same thing where we create a Supabase client by calling the create client function, which comes in from at supabase/supabase-js, and passing it our process.env.supabase-URL and Supabase anon key, we'll see this error that process is not defined. And that's because these environment variables are only available server-side, and so that's in our loaders and actions in Remix world. So if we need access to these in our component, we need to pipe them through from our loader. So we can create a new variable called env, and this can be equal to an object which has our Supabase URL set to process.env.supabase-URL, and again the same for our anon key. We can then return that env variable from our loader, and then down in our component, we can destructure our env by calling use loader data, which again comes in from @remixrun/react, and then we can remove the process dot part of this statement because we're just grabbing these directly from env. Now if we save this file and then refresh the browser, we'll see that we're back in a working state. Now it's important when we're using Supabase client-side, so in our components, outside of our loaders and actions, it's important that we just have one single instance of this Supabase client. So we can make sure that's the case by using a little trick here with useState, which comes in from React. And then we can pass useState a function, which it will ensure is only called once. And so in that function, that's where we want to instantiate our new Supabase client. And then when we call useState, we get back a getter and a setter. And so we only actually care about that first value, which is our Supabase client. And that's how we can ensure that this Supabase client is a singleton. So now down in our component, immediately before our outlet, we want to render out these 3 buttons. So one for signing up, one for signing in, and one for signing out. We then need to declare these functions above. So before we return, we're going to declare one function for signing up, which just calls supabase.auth.signup. We're then passing an email and password. So in this case, john@supabase.com, and then my super secure password. And then for sign in, we're calling supabase.auth.signin with password and passing that same email and password. And then for sign out, we're just calling supabase.auth.signout. And now if we save that and refresh the page, we'll see our sign up, sign in, and sign out buttons. So let's click sign up to create our user. Now we won't see any feedback here, but if we go back to our Supabase dashboard and go to authentication and then users, and we'll drag this out a little so we can see, we'll see that our new user, Jon@supabase.com, has been created and is now waiting for verification. So if I head on over to my email, I can verify this account by clicking confirm your mail. And now this is opening in the incorrect browser, but if I close that and head back to my application, so if we open up the console and head over to the application tab, and then come down here to local storage and make sure we have localhost over port 3000 selected. Now, if we sign in, we'll see this auth token from Supabase, which contains all of the information about our session. And if we click sign out, that will be removed. So we can now toggle signing in and signing out our user. So now that we have users, we can make our database schema a little bit more interesting. If we head over to our Supabase dashboard and then go to the table editor, we can now delete this test table and we can create a new table for our profiles. Again, we're going to leave row level security enabled. And then down here where we have our columns for ID, I might just zoom out a little bit so this doesn't look as broken, but we're going to set up a foreign key relationship between this profiles table and the auth.users table, which Supabase uses for managing sessions. So we can find that table in this dropdown. So we're looking for auth users, and then the column we want to reference is ID. And let's click save to set up that relationship. So basically every row in our profiles table is going to reference a specific user. So let's also add a column for username, and this one is going to be of type text. And let's click save to create that table. And now we want to create a profile for our signed in user. So let's go over to authentication and users and copy this user ID from here. Can then go back to the table editor and go to our profiles table and then insert a new row for this ID. And our username is going to be John. Let's click save to insert that profile. And now if we go back to our application and refresh, we shouldn't be getting back any data because the test table no longer exists. So let's go and update that in our code to be profiles. And now you'll see we're getting back an empty array. So let's make sure that we're signed in and then refresh just to make sure that that's not the problem. But if you remember from earlier, we've now created a new table. And so if we go over to authentications and policies, we'll see that RLS is enabled, but we don't have any policies yet. So let's create a new policy. And again, this policy is going to enable read access for users. It's going to be on the select action. And this time we're going to select the role authenticated because we have authenticated users. And we only want authenticated users to be able to select their profile. So then for our expression, we're just going to make it true again, and then click review, and then save policy. And now if we go back to our application and refresh again, we're still seeing an empty array. So we're not getting back those profiles from Supabase. So what's going on here? If we go back to our code and go back up to root.tsx, and let's simulate making that same request to Supabase, only doing it from the client side instead of the server. So loaders and actions run server side, and useEffect runs on the client. So let's bring that in from React. And you'll see we're just selecting all columns from the test table. So let's update this to the profiles table. And then we're just console logging out the data. So let's refresh our page and open up the console. And if we have a look at this object, it looks like client side, we are getting the correct profiles. And this is because, as we saw earlier, Supabase Auth stores all of the session information in local storage. And since our loader gets called on the server, it has no access to local storage. And therefore, when we create a new Supabase client, it has no idea who our user is. If we want to send along this session information to the server, then we need to use cookies instead of local storage. And thankfully, there is a super easy 3-step process to doing this. So, step 1, we need to install the Remix Auth Helpers. This is a package we've created at Supabase to make managing your session with cookies as simple as local storage. The second step in this process is to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And then once you've done that, and make sure you've done that, then your loader will just magically work. And we'll give you a free cookie for subscribing. Okay, so let's start by installing the Remix Auth Helpers. So again, we'll use npm to install at supabase/auth-helpers-remix. And when that's finished, we can run our development server again. And then what was the second step? Oh, that's right, to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And make sure you hit that notification button too, or your app might not work properly. All right, let's move on to step 3 and refactor our app to use the Remix Auth Helpers. So back up in our root.tsx file, we're importing the create client function from @supabase/supabase-js. We instead want to import this function from @supabase/auth-helpers-remix. Now, if we have a look at where we're actually creating our client, this is the singleton instance that we're using across our components. So we're using this client side or in the browser. So in the Auth Helpers package, we have separate functions for creating a browser client versus creating a server client. So in this case, we want to import create browser client and then replace our call to create client with a call to create browser client. And so now if we save and then come back over to local storage and clear out this value, now if we click sign in, we'll see that nothing appears here. But if we come down to cookies and look at localhost over port 3000, we now have our Supabase token. And again, if we sign out, so we've now swapped out the storage mechanism for Supabase Auth from local storage to cookies. And now we can close this and head back over to dashboard.tsx to refactor our loader to instead create a server client, which again comes in from @supabase/auth-helpers-remix. And then you'll see this is lit up red because TypeScript is telling us that we need a little bit more information. We're passing across our Supabase URL and our Supabase anon key, but since we're now using cookies, we also need to pass across the request and the response. So we can destructure the request from the parameters that are passed to our loader, and we can tell TypeScript to expect loader args, which comes in from @remixrun/node. And now we can create an empty response by saying new response, and then we can pass these additional parameters to the create server client function. And while we're here, we can get rid of our unused import, and then we don't need to change anything about our query to Supabase. But anytime we're using Supabase server-side, we have to return an extra key for headers and set them to the response.headers. And this is because Supabase might need to update that cookie if it's expired. And now if we come back over to our application, make sure we're signed in, and then refresh, we should finally see that profile data coming back from our loader. So now if we go back to Supabase and we invite a new user to our application, so I'm going to invite Thor at supabase.com. And now we don't need him to verify his account, we just need this ID here so that we can come back to the table editor and click on the profiles table and then insert a new profile for Thor. Now ideally you would automate the process of creating a new profile for every user using the combination of a Postgres function and a trigger. So if you want to check out how to do that, click that card above, but we're just going to stick to doing it manually for now. Now in our application, we're signed in as Jon, but if we refresh the page, we can see the profile for both Jon and Thor. But a user should probably only be able to see their profile unless they have elevated privileges. Thankfully, we can fix this really easily in our RLS policy. So let's go back to authentication and then policies, and let's edit our select policy to, instead of just returning true, we check whether the ID column of this particular row matches the return value from calling the auth.uid function. Now this is a special Postgres function that's given to us by Supabase that allows us to check who the user is that's performing this query. So if the user that is trying to select this profile matches the user that this profile is for, then this expression will evaluate to true, and therefore they will be able to read that row. Then when this policy gets evaluated for the second row in our database, our Jon user doesn't match our Thor user, and so therefore this expression will evaluate to false, and they won't be able to read that row. So if we click review and save, and then go back to our application and refresh, we'll see that Jon is only able to see Jon's profile, and if we sign out and refresh, then we're not able to see any of the profiles. Now it's a little bit annoying that we need to click sign in and then refresh to be able to see that data, or click sign out and then again need to refresh. And this is because while we've configured Supabase Auth to use cookies instead of local storage, the authentication process itself still happens client-side, and therefore Remix has no idea that anything has changed, and so hasn't called our loaders again. So we want to detect when the user signs in or signs out, and then manually tell Remix we need to revalidate the data. Thankfully, Supabase exposes a hook called on/or/state_change, which does exactly this. So let's go back up to our root.tsx file, and then we can repurpose our use effect from earlier, as we no longer need this one. And instead we want to say supabase.auth.on/auth_state_change, and then this takes a callback function, which Supabase will call anytime our user signs in or signs out. And so this is where we want to call our loaders. And as of the most recent version of Remix, I think 1.10.0, we now have the use revalidator hook. So we can create a revalidator by calling use revalidator, which comes in from @remixrun/react. And then in our callback function, we can use that revalidator to call revalidate, which will go and call the loader functions for any routes active on the page. And then to do some cleanup, when we call on/or/state_change, we get back some data. And then that data object has a subscription. So then to clean up that subscription, we can return an arrow function from useEffect. And in here, we can call subscription.unsubscribe. And now that our useEffect has an external dependency on Supabase, as well as our revalidator, we need to add them to the dependency array. And now when we go back to our application and refresh, we can sign out and our data is updated immediately to not show any profiles. And when we sign back in, our profile is immediately fetched from Supabase, showing only the data that our user should be able to see. And that's how easy it is to use the Supabase Auth Helpers to swap local storage for cookies, making our user's session available anywhere in our application. So in our components client side or on the server in our loaders and actions. If you want to go deeper with Remix and Supabase, you should totally check out my brand new entirely free Egghead course, where I basically extend on what we covered here to build a real-time chat application. It goes much more into depth into fetching data server side, automatically generating TypeScript definitions for our Supabase instance, and merging real-time events with data from our loaders. Links to that one in the description, but once again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.